Time for my long belated explanation of the poor Swedes who tried to take a hot air balloon over the North Pole. It didn't work. Well, that was a short video. I realised this bit would have worked better if I had an ending song for these videos. Before I begin, most of the visuals you're going to see here are going to be a mix of the flight of the Eagle, a film dramatization of the events, and actual photographs. Photographs taken by the actual guys themselves, because when you're trapped in the Arctic, you might as well act like a tourist. Fingers crossed that the Franklin guys felt the same way, assuming we ever find their camera bag. Spoiler, we won't. Anyway, let's begin. It was 1897 and Solomon August Andree was kind of a big deal in 19th century Sweden. He was the first Swedish balloonist and as such was the closest thing they had to a Eurovision contestant at the time. Andree was a big believer in technology's ability to defeat nature, that it moved ever forward and would inevitably win out. So it was weirdly expected that he'd assume that a balloon, the travelling technological marvel of the age, could defeat the Arctic. After all, people had already gone so high that they were above the clouds. The record altitude reached was over 30,000 feet, the height of a passenger airplane today. His plan was simple: raise the balloon, use 3 dragging ropes as a kind of a rudder and head north. Then hopefully end up in either Russia or Canada, because apparently the only thing the rudder could accurately be directed towards was the pole. I'm actually only partly kidding. His planned destination was either Canada or Russia. Andree was such a big deal that he convinced King Oscar of Sweden and Alfred Nobel to support his efforts. It was a bit embarrassing that for a northern country, Sweden had fallen so far behind countries like the UK and the USA in the quest for the North Pole. And to make it even worse for the Swedish nationalism, the record for furthest north had been set a few years earlier by Nansen and Johansen, Norwegians, and Norway was being ruled by Sweden at the time. Fun fact, but Johansen later joined Roald Amundsen in his efforts for the South Pole. But then Amundsen made a mistake and left too early in the season and they ran straight into a storm. Amundsen left Johansen and another man to fend for themselves and they were left with no tent, no equipment, minus 50-degree weather and a dangerous descent back to base. Johansen gave Amundsen a piece of his mind, Amundsen had Johansen fired, and then did his best to write him out of the expedition's history. Johansen later committed suicide, his career in tatters. Sorry, that wasn't much fun after all, was it? Actual fun fact, Max von Sydow, who played Andree in The Flight of the Eagle, played Nansen in The Last Place on Earth. A really great miniseries about the race for the South Pole. Anyway, Andree had a top-of-the-line balloon made in Paris, the world capital of ballooning. He called it the Eagle, and it had problems. The cold made it bleed hydrogen. And Andree, depending on who you ask, either underestimated the effect of the loss, or was actively topping it up and trying to hide the problem in what can only be described as an extremely expensive suicide attempt. Exactly how useful the guide rope system that Andree devised is open to questions, but it definitely didn't work when not long after takeoff the dragging ropes must drag them into the polar sea. They dropped over 1,000 pounds of rope and almost 500 pounds of sandbags to get airborne again. Now this might sound fine, but it basically turned the balloon from a theoretically steerable craft to a typical balloon at the time, with some ropes hanging from it. To make things worse, the loss of the sandbags meant that there wasn't enough weight to keep the craft stable, and as a result it shot into the sky, high enough to make the leaks even worse. Andree had 2 companions on this mission, Knut Frenkel and Nils Strindberg. Strindberg was a photographer and a scientist in his own right, but Frenkel was just a young guy who was enthusiastic about the expedition. Andree brought him on to replace a guy called Ecom that he'd fired for telling him that the balloon was a tad banjaxed. You see, Ecom was a scientist and quite smart. How smart? He was warning about climate change due to fossil fuel burning in the Victorian era, and he even tried to convince King Oscar to pull his support, knowing it would stop the launch. Anyway, the journey continued to go well. Extra weight due to all the ice and rain and the loss of hydrogen meant that they were constantly in danger of crashing into the ice. Of course, they could fix that by chucking out more stuff, but that just made it less stable, sent them skyward again, which made them lose even more hydrogen and then fall again. It must have been like being in a roller coaster made of drops and ice. All in all, they lasted about 50 hours before the balloon landed, and in that time, none of the men got any sleep. Now, they had some equipment for Arctic travel, such as skis, snowshoes, and a tent, but like many explorers before them, they diligently refused to bring skins, and instead stuck to what looks like hunting gear. That's good for Scotland. In autumn. I honestly found their choice of clothing completely baffling. That doesn't even look warm enough for Scandinavia, let alone the Arctic. Yeah, they weren't planning on going on foot, but it'd hardly been any warmer in the sky. So they had to start walking and decided on what they believed was their closest food depot, which is in Franz Josef Land, a fair bit north of Russia. The food they had on the balloon was solid and heavy because Andree decided that it should also act as ballast, which is clever until you have to drag it. When they set off, the sleds weighed about 500 pounds and they pulled one each. After a week, they abandoned almost 200 pounds of food and equipment each. Now, unlike the Franklin expedition, the men weren't starving. Apart from the food they had on them, they had quite a bit of luck finding game, eating seals, walrus, polar bears during their march. And on top of that, they had the usual Victorian explorer supplies, like alcohol and opium. Them being drunk or high might actually explain some of what happened. Eventually, they discovered that the ice they were on was moving in the wrong direction, so all the time they spent walking, they barely moved. They then changed direction to Svalbard. Of course, the ice was even rougher in that direction, and many times they had to go on all fours just to pull their sledges over the ice. And their gloves weren't waterproof. Almost none of their clothes were. They dried them by wearing them. Anyway, after more weeks walking, they discovered that the ice had changed direction, and they were being taken away from Svalbard faster than they could walk. So they decided to camp out in the ice and see where they ended up. They had supplies, and people had wintered in ice floes before. Well, competent, well-stocked people, if they were lucky. But they were optimistic. Within a month, the ice broke underneath their feet, and they were forced to move over to White Island, part of the Svalbard archipelago and the easternmost part of Norway, where with any luck, they could finish the winter and begin anew in a few months. Within days, all three were dead. And it wouldn't be until 1930, when someone else set foot in the island, it's usually inaccessible by ship, that the three's diaries, bodies, and equipment were found in great condition. That's how we know so much of what happened. The weird thing is, we don't actually know why they died. Let's be honest, a lot of things could have killed them, from hypothermia to being poisoned by seal. And it had to happen quickly because no one wrote about it in their diary. To make matters worse for the investigators, the three were given a hero's funeral at short notice and then cremated before their bodies could be autopsied. Andree was a big believer in cremation, and someone higher up shrugged and figured the other two wouldn't mind. It's a bit like a king's servants being buried with them. Both hypothermia and poison by seal are actual theories put forth for their deaths, and the seal is seal liver in particular. It's got toxic levels of vitamin A, which leads to stuff like your skin peeling off, and eventually death if you eat enough of it. The same thing happens with polar bear and walrus, so if you're in the Arctic, don't eat the liver. Bia Usman wrote a cool book about the expedition that was cleverly called The Expedition. And the whole last section is just listing possible reasons for their deaths and explaining the evidence for and against. She eventually concludes that Strindberg was killed by a polar bear. Wait, no, he died first. Then Frekel died, probably due to injuries sustained in the attack, and Andree, sitting alone in the camp, a monument to his failure, committed suicide with morphine. From the men's diaries, you can see that they remained superhumanly optimistic throughout their ordeal, calling an area with flat ice and clean drinking water paradise. The pages are filled with comments like, "Morale remains good," even after months freezing wet in a state of near collapse. The last coherent part of Andree's diary ends with such comrades, one should be able to manage under, I may say, any circumstances. Not quite, but you gave it a good effort. There's a lot of questions, but how much of Andree's poor choices were incompetence and how much were pressure from the outside? He essentially had a very successful crowdfunding effort, backed by very powerful people, and he had a limited space to succeed or he'd be ruined. It's easy to laugh at the comedy of errors in this story, and I can't stop you, I recorded this ages ago, but there's something very impressive in how they kept trying, failing, and never complaining. If only they'd packed better, or even better, listened to Ike Cold. In a perfect epilogue, the only survivor of the expedition, one of Andree's homing pigeons, landed on a steamer to pass on its positive message that things were going well, and it was promptly shot.